You may have heard of things like working from light to dark. In this video, I've got 7 basic watercolor principles. If you stick to these, you're going to improve your paintings. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Michelle, and on this channel you'll find all things watercolor, including mixed media, drawing, and even a little bit of motivation and business for artists too. Please do consider subscribing. If you click the bell icon, you'll get notified every time I have a new video for you. I make at least one free video a week here on YouTube on a Thursday with extra content for Patreon subscribers. So we're looking at basic principles in this video for watercolor painting, by which I mean principles that you can sort of almost live by, things that you should always be adhering to, always be doing. No, they're not a set of strict rules, but they are just things to consider. They're not only things like working from light to dark, which we're going to talk about because people often get that one wrong, but they're also principles that I've been teaching people for over 20 years in real life classrooms. So let's get started. And let's look at that first principle that I spoke about, working from light to dark. So if you're a complete beginner, you might be wondering, why do you work light to dark in watercolor? Basically because it's transparent. You can't paint light over dark. In other words, you can't paint a bright red flower with white spots on. You have to almost have the white spots and then paint round it. This is called negative painting. So you can leave light areas and paint round, or you can reserve light areas with things like masking techniques. I've got lots of other videos on that if you're interested. But people often get this principle wrong. I've walked around classrooms and I've seen people sort of, layering up to get an area darker and darker and darker until they get it as dark as they want. And they say, well, I've been told I have to layer light to dark, I have to go light to dark. And I just think to myself, it's dark, put it in straight away. So working light to dark does not mean that you have to take an area that's going to end up dark and spend, 15 different washes getting it there. That's absolutely pointless. What it talks about is the order in which you apply your paint to the paper. So you shouldn't be putting that dark area in first. And there's a colour element to this that people often miss out because they think to themselves, well, the light to dark rule, it's entirely tonal. It has nothing to do with colour. And kind of on the surface that seems to be true, but I see people get this wrong because of colour quite often. And what happens is this: imagine you have something like some bright red flowers and there's a concrete path behind them, a sort of a very neutral, kind of grey, kind of cream pathway behind those red flowers. And you look at this and you think to yourself, oh God, look at that path. I've no idea how to mix that colour. That's a really unusual colour. Don't really know how to get my watercolours light enough or how to mix that exact shade. Let's look at these red flowers. Oh, look, they're bright red. I've got that exact colour in my palette. And so we go ahead and we put the red in, and then we've got to get the light colour around the edges. Now, we've talked about negative painting. Even if you are very neat at painting and you're completely capable of painting around the edge of these flowers, there's something to be considered, and that is that colours with red in, by which I also mean purple and orange, colours with red in run really, really easily, and so do some other dark colours, some of the blues. So if you put those bright colours in first, those dark colours in first, even though you might be perfectly capable of painting around them, what you're going to find is that as you go up to the edge, they bleed. So if you're a beginner, I want you to always consider this light to dark rule. And if you're just looking at a painting and thinking, God, I have no idea where to start, then it's a good idea to enforce that light to dark rule. Just look for the lightest areas and think about working those through. I mean, the very lightest areas will be any white areas. So you want to start by reserving those, and then you want to be painting light to dark. This gives you the option of painting darks over lights if you need to. It does not mean that you have to build up dark areas in 25 layers, because who has time for that stuff? Now, there are some exceptions to this rule. This rule doesn't go for every single painting. For instance, if you're doing a landscape, it's nearly always a good idea to put the sky in first. You'll start to understand these things as you become more experienced at painting. But if you're ever starting a painting and you're just looking at it and you're just thinking to yourself, I am completely lost here, I've no idea what to do first, then follow the rule of light to dark. Now, this next principle is one that all professional artists they know in the back of their minds, but it's not spoken about enough and it's not expressed to beginners enough, and that is that a bad drawing will never make a good painting. Now, of course, there could be an exception if you're working in an opaque medium such as oil painting. You know, you might do a bad drawing, and then if you're really, really good at painting, you could adjust it with the paints. But that's not going to happen with watercolors, and it's nearly always the case with all mediums, actually, that you need to have a solid basis for your drawing. Now, where this goes wrong is in several ways. You can have something that's, you know, a really, really simple drawing, and so you can just sort of not spend enough time on it. You think, well, it's just a house and a tree. Don't have to worry too much about that. Quick sketch and I'll get on with the painting. And then you realise later on that you weren't really careful enough about how you drew those things, and now you're in trouble with the painting. It can happen where beginners take on subjects that are just way too complex for them, and they don't have the drawing skills to execute properly. So the drawing is wrong. And there's a strange thing with painting and drawing. Sometimes you don't see the mistakes that are in front of your nose. Have you ever started a painting and you think there's something wrong with it, you can't figure out what it is, and then you go out of the room, which I always advise you to do, and take a break. You come back, you can instantly see the bit that's wrong. And so there can be a situation whereby you can do a drawing that you think is okay, and then when you actually come to put the paint on, you realise that it wasn't good enough. Another way that this can go wrong is whereby you have a drawing that's just too scruffy, and you've just got mess and grease all over the paper. You've got loads of eraser marks, you've dented the paper, you've smudged the paper, and you've got too much graphite pencil on it. In this case, what I would suggest, if you really can't do a neat drawing and you need to spend a lot of time on your drawings erasing to get them right, and that's absolutely a great thing that you should be doing. If you need to do that, then what I suggest you do is to make your drawing on just a piece of sketch paper and then transfer it across with tracing paper. There's a big taboo about tracing, but if you've already drawn it, it's absolutely fine to trace it across. I see so many people on social media asking for help on paintings. I've had my own students email me pictures that they're doing, paintings that they're making, and they're like, Michelle, can you just help me with this? I'm not sure I've got this colour right, and have I got the grading in the sky right? And I just look at it and think, your drawing is wrong. If the drawing is wrong with a watercolour, you are never ever going to be able to fix it. So however complex or simple that subject is, do make sure you're 100% happy with the drawing. That may mean leaving it alone for a little while, taking a break and coming back to it. Make sure that you are 100% happy with your drawing before you put any paint on it, because a bad drawing never becomes a good painting. And we can take this principle even further to say that colour will almost always make your mistakes look worse. So next we have another principle that's always used by professional artists in almost all mediums, but it's sometimes avoided by beginners because it can seem difficult to understand or just a little bit too complex. So let me make it simple for you. And this is the idea of using a limited palette. Now, this does not mean that you can only own a few colours. It doesn't mean that you've got to get everything in order and spend ages making colour swatches, although colour swatches are a good idea. All it means is that within a particular painting, you don't use too many different colours. And it's as simple as that. So what I want you to do is when you start a painting, just have a look at the colours that you're going to use and start picking out a few. Now, a limited palette will vary depending on the subject. If it's something simple like a sunset with very few colours in, you could just perhaps use 3. If it were a garden painting and you had tons of different colours, you might go up to 10 or 15. But an average for a limited palette would be somewhere between maybe 4 and 7 colours. If you use a limited range of colours like this, then what it's going to do is going to make your whole painting hang together. It's going to look more professional, and it's going to give it a certain look. So you imagine if you choose the same subject, I might do this for a YouTube video actually, if you choose the same subject and you use maybe warm colours for this, and then you maybe use cool colours in another, or you use bright colours against using muted colours, you're going to get a completely different look to your painting. None of them are wrong or right, they're just your interpretation. So what I would do is choose that small limited selection of colours. Don't make it, an absolute rod for your own back. I chose these 3 colours at the beginning, now I need another colour, I can't add it. Of course you can add it. It's just a loose rule to get you started and to keep you from using every single colour in your palette, which will lead to a painting that looks really dysfunctional and doesn't hang together well and doesn't portray a certain mood or atmosphere. So start with a few colours and then only add more colours in if you find that you absolutely need them and can't mix them from the colours that you chose at the beginning. If you don't know how to start a limited palette, then what I would suggest is choosing 3 primary colours. So that's a red or a pink, a yellow and a blue, and then making sure that you have a staining colour. So one of those colours, probably the blue or the red, might be a staining colour. But if you don't have a staining colour, then add a fourth colour in so that you have a staining colour. This is important, otherwise you won't get enough tonal contrast in your work. So start with those 3 or 4 colours. As you work through your painting, try to mix every other colour you need from those initial colours, and if you can't, then that's the time when you add another colour. Write your colours down as you go along, and you're going to find that your paintings hang together and look much more professional. So the next principle is to push through the ugly stage. Have you heard of the ugly stage? No, I'm not talking about when you get up first thing in the morning, you look in the mirror and you go, oh my God, how did I get that old? What I'm talking about is the ugly stage that every piece of artwork goes through. Now, this is well known to professional painters because at the beginning you have so much potential to your work. You've just got a light drawing, you've maybe started putting a little bit of paint on, and you're thinking to yourself, wow, this is going to be fantastic. At the end, of course, you may end up with a really nice painting. There's a stage in the middle whereby you've started applying quite a lot of colour and you're just thinking to yourself, well, this isn't going to plan. It really doesn't look very good at all. I don't know what's wrong with it, but I'm really not going in the right direction. It's not looking fantastic. I had all these high hopes at the beginning and it's all turned out to be nothing because I'm ruining this painting. The ugly stage is well known to professional artists. You just have to push through it. Now, why would you find that the ugly stage in watercolours is even more pronounced than other mediums? And that's because, as we spoke at the beginning, you need to work light to dark. And what this means, unlike oil painting where you would traditionally work dark to light, you don't have to, but most people do. What this means is that as you get to that mid stage, all you've applied are lights and midtones, and so your work is likely to look murky and muddy and wishy-washy. A lot of times people think paintings look muddy. It's just lack of tonal contrast. I've got a video about how to avoid muddy paintings. I'll post that one in the description of this video. But you're going to find with watercolours, they really don't come to life until those last few final touches when we're putting the darks in. So push through the ugly stage. It's really not a good idea at all to abandon your work halfway through. At this stage of the video, if you're enjoying this, if you're getting some value from it, can I just ask you please to click that like button? YouTube responds to audience interaction, so if you like, share, subscribe, or leave me a comment, YouTube will push this video out to more people. At the moment, I'm trying to reach 100,000 subscribers, and I'm so grateful to all of you who watch me here on YouTube. So the next principle is really, really basic, and it applies only to watercolour, and that's that if you look at the name watercolour, the first word is water. Your paint must flow. Far too many people come in from other mediums or perhaps just have no experience of watercolour whatsoever, and they're either adding too much water or not enough. So if we look at adding too much water, we've all seen those pretty sort of delicate Victorian watercolours. They look lovely at the time, but you know, to our modern eyes that are surrounded by very strong colour and drama, they really don't look very attractive, do they? So we want that strength of colour, and you absolutely can get it with watercolour. It's a complete myth that watercolours have to be wishy-washy. They can be very, very strongly coloured. Now let's look at the other end of the spectrum, which is not using enough water. Now people often say to me, well, how much water, and can you give me a percentage? I absolutely can't, and the reason I can't give you a percentage of how much water to use is because paints are made often from natural pigments, and even the synthetic ones, they all vary so much. Some of them are incredibly strong and some of them are very weak. As a rough guide, the paint should flow nicely across the paper. Your paintbrush shouldn't be skipping and leaving little rough marks unless you're going for a dry brush technique where you're doing that on purpose. Your paint absolutely should flow. It shouldn't be thick and sticky. You shouldn't be able to use it in pasto, which means to actually build up in layers so it stands up off of the paper like some kind of cake icing. So impasto is not something that's used with watercolour paints. So just check as you're applying it that it's flowing nicely, that you're getting good strength of colour. There are some things that will help with this. You'll need to use a big enough brush. Often when beginners don't get this beautiful flow to their watercolours, it's because the brush they're using is too small. Remember, a small brush doesn't hold much paint, so you might think it's easier to manage a small brush, but actually when it comes to watercolour painting, where you need to be quick, you need to apply broad areas of colour a lot of the time, you need a brush that's large enough to hold that body of water. I almost never go down to a tiny, tiny brush. I mostly work between a large brush and a slightly smaller one. So for a large brush, you'd go for something like a 10 or a 12. I'm talking about the standard brush with the point on the end, the brush that they call a round brush. and then I'd go for something like a 4 or a 6 in the small size. The reason I'm not being specific is because manufacturers don't have a standard sizing that they use. They all vary, which is not helpful. But don't overthink this. You just need the paint to flow well across the paper, and you should be able to paint for some time with the same brush stroke before the paint runs out. If not, you may need to add more water or use a bigger brush. So the next principle I have for you is to prepare your paper surface before you start. So many people just grab a pad of watercolor paper, it's completely loose, it's not taped down in any way, it's not stretched, and they just start painting and they end up with a paper that sort of buckles and wrinkles like this. It's completely avoidable. You do not need to have paper that's going to end up drying wrinkled like this. Now, if you've been following my channel for a while, you'll know that I always advocate for paper stretching. Lots of nonsense talked about it. Oh, it's difficult, it's fiddly, it takes too long. It's really quick and easy. I have a really fast method. I'll link to that video in the description of this video, but you can stretch paper in less time than it takes me to make a cup of tea, and I'm British. I can produce a cup of tea extremely fast, I would say in under a minute. Now, it may be that you don't use stretched paper, that you like to use a watercolor block. Those can work really well as well. They're not available in such a wide range of sizes, but if you paint fairly small, a watercolor block can work. If nothing else, at least tape your paper down. No professional artist would start working on a painting without going through a whole range of preparation. I'm going to do another video soon about how to set up your workspace. Let me know if you're interested in that one. But before you get started, you should at least have prepared your paper surface. It's going to make such a difference to your finished work. Now, there's an idea that the whole idea of buckled paper is just something that affects the end result, and there are all sorts of, they're really crazy, they're really long-winded, there are all sorts of solutions online about how you can flatten your paper after it's buckled. But this doesn't address the point that if you're painting on buckled paper, it's going to make your painting technique worse. Now, why is this? Because if the paper dips like this, the paint is going to sit in the dips. It's going to make puddles basically in the dips, just as it would if you had a hole in the road. The water would come down, it would sit in that hole. What this means in terms of watercolor painting is that your work will dry less evenly. You'll have an uneven drying time because the areas of the paper which go up will dry quickly. The areas in the dips where the paint is sitting will dry slowly. Now, uneven drying is what causes back runs and drying lines and all sorts of things that you don't want on your paper, like cauliflowers, blooms, whatever you call them, those strange little marks that appear. They are going to be made much worse if you're painting on bumpy paper. So it doesn't matter if you can flatten it at the end, that's not the point. And all of those techniques that I've seen take longer than actually stretching your paper in the first place. Now, stretched paper will still buckle very slightly when you're painting on it, as will watercolor blocks, but it will be reduced, and the more you can reduce that paper buckling, the better your painting technique is going to be and the more evenly your paint is going to dry. Now, assuming you've got a good paper surface, you've got a good drawing and your paint application is okay, what actually makes a really good painting? Now, if you've ever wandered, as I have done sometimes here in the UK, wandered around a little sort of local exhibition, a little church exhibition, a lot of amateur work, a lot of paintings that you look at and just think, well, they don't look very professional. I used to look at these and, you know, I'd look at the individual elements of them sometimes, think, well, the drawing's quite nice and I quite like the way they've applied that paint there. You know, why is this not a good painting? Why would I not buy this painting, for example? And the answer was nearly always tonal contrast. Now, tonal contrast is everything. And 9 times out of 10, it's what makes the difference between an amateur painting and a professional painting. I do have a whole video on how you can get better at improving tonal contrast in your paintings, but I've got a couple of tips for you here in this video. The first one is stop outlining your work in pen. Now, I don't mean it's wrong to work in pen. Working in ink and watercolor is a fabulous medium and it's a great thing to do if you set out to do it. But if you get halfway through your painting and you're thinking, or even to the end of your painting, you're thinking, oh, doesn't really, you know, it's not really popping, I'll just outline it in ink. That is an absolute sure sign that you do not have the correct amount of tonal contrast. Your watercolor should work alone without any ink outlining. If it's not working, if you're constantly wanting to outline your work, then what you actually need to do is to stop yourself from doing that. Make a decision at the beginning of the painting. Is this a painting with ink or is this a watercolor painting? And if it's just a pure watercolor painting, promise yourself that you're going to stick to that right through to the end. And when you get to the end and you're feeling like outlining, Instead, I want you to improve the tonal contrast. The next tip I have for you for doing this is take a photograph of your work and look at it on your computer or on your phone. Turn the saturation right down and just look at it in black and white. Does it work in black and white? If it doesn't work in black and white, if you can't see the difference between certain areas, then what you're doing is you're over-relying on colour. You're thinking that because one area and another area are different colours, then that's going to be enough for them to show up. But our eyes are trained to look for tonal contrast. So the colours could be completely different colours, but if they're similar tone, your painting is not going to pop. It's not going to look professional. Don't forget to check out my video on tonal contrast. I'll put it in the description of this video. There's lots of other ways that you can learn from that video to get better at tonal contrast. So one of the things that I talked about in this video, and I talk about in many of my videos, is the importance of getting a good underdrawing. At the end of this video, I'm going to link to another video that I've made that's going to help you with that and give you some really simple, quick tricks that you can use to improve your drawing. Before you leave this video, don't forget to go down to the video description. I've got all the videos that I mentioned in this video linked. You can also grab some free downloadable PDFs for no money whatsoever. I've even got a free watercolor painting course that you can take, and you can find out as well about my Patreon subscription where you can follow along with my own work step by step, and you can also find out about all of my paid courses, including my complete drawing for beginners. And you can watch the drawing video that I mentioned right now.